Bienvenidos a la...
Good afternoon. Welcome to panel number 6, Eugenic Legacies. Eugenic Legacies. In this panel, that has to do with living bodies and shared. Well, we have. We're going to have Diana Vite and Gustavo. I'm sorry, I'm going to present Carlos Halaburda, his PhD in literature, the Gothic of supremacy, melodrama, and whiteness in Latin America, examines how white elites associated whiteness with their experience. The project studies how a series of medical and literary fictions created melodramatic tropes on virtue, innocence, and dignity to create whiteness as a phenotypical condition, and that put the mixed. His current works are going to be published on the Symposium of Heavy Metals. Natalie Poussin co-edited an introduction, a commented introduction to the edition of the first naturalist novel, Deborah of 1984, Tomás Michelena, a pioneer work in presenting the social links in the century, during the 19th century, and investigation of humanities, and also the Ibero-American Institute of the Global Matters in the United States. So currently he's a post-PhD research at the University of Toronto under the supervision of Susanna Tisch. He conducts a workshop about feminism, queer women, and the face of women in Latin America, using transversal queer and trans studies. The project tries to create a new vision on the culture and on the decimonanic point of view. Carlos?
Salvador, quizás hacer la presentación, la semblanza también de Diana.
De Diana de una vez. Ok, perfecto. Pensé que iba a hacerlo.
I'm going to make also the presentation of Diana.
Presento también a Diana Vite Hernández de Femidiscas.
Diana Vite Hernández from Femidiscas in Mexico, and of GTM of Disability, Master on Philosophy by the University of Michoacán in Morelia, Michoacán, and a bachelor's degree of the National University of Mexico. She has collaborated in civil society projects, and some things that she's interested in during her workshops, and it's the fragility of the body, the experience of disability practices, counter capacitist practices, and feminism. So I now give floor to the presentation. Sorry for my mistake.
Good morning. It's a pleasure and a privilege to have the opportunity to share with you the advances of my research on queer and crip narratologies of Latin American end-of-century psychiatry. I would like to extend my thanks to Susan Anteby of the University of Toronto for inviting me to be part of this prestigious working group on eugenic legacies in Mexico and the Americas. I would also like to take this opportunity to tell you that in the next 2 years, I will be part of the Department of Spanish and Portuguese at the University of Toronto, where I will develop a postdoctoral project on sexualities and eccentric genders of the end of the century under the supervision of Professor Anteby. In this presentation, entitled The Literary Lives of the Nerves, Hysteria, Bovarism, and Disability in the Clinic of Between Centuries, I propose to examine a history little addressed by the cultural history of Latin American medicine, which is the intersection between novel reading and physical cognitive disability. In what follows, I will explore how the reading of novels became a core aspect of the legal medical discourse and reproductive control techniques in Latin America of the late 19th century, from a discussion on literary escapism that denoted the classic picture of Bovarism, that is to say, of inordinate imagination. I will address how the clinic produced psychopathologies to somatize readers whose solitary habits led to morphine addiction, reclusiveness, hysteria, and neurosis. The organizing hypothesis for this work suggests that reading in excess that transcended occasional pleasure would take over the body completely. And, according to the psychiatric imagination, such readers would become antisocial figures that blocked the future of the nation. Thus, in the following pages, I will attempt to unravel what I call the Bovaristic performance of the clinic. That is, a series of dramatized operations of a biopolitical technique of somatization of mismanaged readings. I address the writings of the Mexican doctor Enrique Abogado, entitled A Case of Cured Delirious Hysteria of 1907, in the journal Archives of Psychiatry and Criminology, edited by José Ingenieros and Francisco de Vega. But Enrique Abogado is also famous for being the director of the Mexican Medical Chronicle, a publication where various neurological studies will be distributed, where, of course, hallucination and excessive reading will also have a very important presence. I will then go on to discuss the case entitled Bromiomania in Epileptics from 1913. This is a study by José María Ramos Mejía, a famous turn-of-the-century doctor, and also the author of The Neurosis of Famous Men in Argentine History. I close with a tentative conclusion in which I underline the relevance of paying attention to the props and scripts of the psychiatric drama that looked at the novel as the origin of the star disease of the end of the century, namely neurosis. 1. Bovarism and morphine-induced reclusion. A few years after the publication of Flaubert's novel, the French philosopher Jules de Gaultier coined the notion of Bovarism in 1892. His book, Le Bovarisme, la psychologie dans l'œuvre de Flaubert, described pathology personified in the light of the most famous of the 19th century, who became a romantic heroine inappropriately identified with the characters of fiction. Gaultier diagnosed the unleashing of the imagination, the result of an unsatisfied life. Bovarism, according to the best-known quote in the book, was the power given to man to conceive of himself as someone else whom he is not. It was a permanent need, according to Gaultier, so that, going beyond the borders of the feminine gender and the work of Flaubert itself, this medical notion gradually became a universalized feature. Bovarism has been seen by psychiatry as a disease akin to hysteria, the mother of all hypersexualized neurological conditions of the 19th century. In Degeneration, the Hungarian physician Max Nordau re-examined the studies of the Viennese psychiatrist Benedict Augustin Morel with respect to the traditional etiology of degeneration, highlighting the negative impact of the ingestion of toxic substances on human health. Nordau's contribution underlined that the new decadent arts of the end of the century, modern life and urbanization, had resulted in a symptomatology caused by undue cultural consumption. The literature of the time, the doctor pointed out, was the work of degenerates. The enthusiasm of their admirers was the manifestation of more or less pronounced moral insanity, imbecility, and dementia. He neutralized the presence of the degenerative, the conduct of which was both sexual, hereditary, as discussed in the great number of studies published at the time, as well as chemical and literary. That is, this mixture of narcotics and improper reading turned into the persistent conviction that a cardinal disaster was approaching and drastic measures were called for. This is what Mike J. and Michael Neve affirm, and I quote, "From the scientific point of view, it was vital that it should be the end of the era of the degenerate or unfit." Neutralize. This degenerative presence is going to become the main trope of the studies, which are going to combine neurology with improper readings. Morel, Gaultier, Kraft-Ebing, and Nordau. Here, a clear trajectory of these improper readings and their nervous hobbies can be traced. In other words, in Latin America, the tropes of Bovarism were of great interest to psychiatrists at the end of the 19th century, who turned it into a very fashionable form of hysteria, accompanied by narcotic stimulations, dissident sexual practices, and eccentric habits. That is to say, practices invested with the power of death. We can see here an illustration by Carlo Cessa from Flaubert's novel, The Death of Emma Bovary, which is interpreted to be the result of a lifetime of bad reading habits that she triggers in her imagination, that triggers her actions, which then endanger her life and also that of the reproductive futures of the French bourgeoisie. The concept was incorporated into the symptoms of various mental disorders before relapsing into relative oblivion. This explosive cocktail of extravagances will appear narrated in one of the Bovarian scenes that I am interested in discussing below. This is the case of the young ladies R and V, that is told by the Dr. Enrique Abogado, director of the Mexican Medical Chronicle, for the Argentine magazine Archives. In 1907, Abogado publishes a case of cured delusional hysteria, where he tells the story of two young women from a wealthy and extensive family that star in it. After the death of their parents, the sisters enter a prolonged state of confinement, isolating themselves from their social orbits. Abogado points out that Miss R had been healthy in her youth, of a lively, sociable, educated character, and drawn to reading, leading us to suppose that this was not properly chosen. This is the first indication of the deadly causes of inconvenient reading that I am interested in highlighting. R will suffer neuralgia, and morphine injections will be given to her. And I quote, "Since then, the effects of this poison began to be felt on her intellectual faculties." Close quote. R dies of a brain disorder after a decade of addictions, both to morphine and love affairs. The report will highlight that mental imbalances exerted a bad influence on her sister, V, who suffered from the pathological cloistering that, for the doctor, had been fueled by a pernicious substitute for social life and a sick ritual, reading novels. The sisters, incestuously, according to the suggestive story of Abogado, shut themselves up to read. Before the accident, I quote, that determined the death of their father, there is nothing worthy of special mention in the home life led by the two younger sisters, R and V, but the fact that they were always linked by singular and reciprocal affection. But after that unfortunate event, the conditions of that house naturally changed, and the formerly habitual gatherings and distractions were suppressed. It seems that the unchecked reading of novels, so damaging in certain temperaments, especially in the female sex, replaced theaters, gatherings, and other entertainments of the mind frequented during the life of the head of the family. So, about 7 years passed, more or less. Close quote. They spent a few more years of coexistence until the death of R. Finally, Miss V resumes her social life, but the unchecked reading of novels had wreaked havoc, from causing drug addictions to the insinuated incest. Novel reading, as a depraved custom, had replaced theaters and other spaces for the exhibition of feminine charms. The young women, confined to reading, had started deviant associations. I quote, Miss V, in perpetual and prolonged connection with her beloved sister, to whom she gave love and obedience in constant, intimate, and exclusive union. Miss R was superior to her in psychic energy, and even if this was abnormal and morbid, she had necessarily to adapt to the more or less strange ideas and to the more or less consequential, illogical, or absurd arguments that Miss R imposed on her. Foucault, who studied the exaltation of vain conversations that arise from readings in the 18th century, makes a direct connection between the novel, sex, and bodily affections, and I quote, In the Middle Ages, at the time of wars and famines, the sick were given over to fear and exhaustion, apoplexy, hectic fevers. But with the 16th and 17th centuries, the feeling of the homeland and the obligations that are had in its respect weakened, selfishness withdraws into itself, lust and gluttony are practiced, venereal diseases, obstruction of the viscera and blood. In the 18th century, the search for pleasure passes through the imagination. You go to the theater, you read novels, you exalt yourself in vain conversations, you stay up at night, you sleep during the day, hence the hysteria, the hypochondria, the nervous diseases. This pursuit of pleasure through fictional imagination, narcotics, and exalted talk formed the core of the clinical performance that diagnosed a disability. It was a dramatization of social hygiene, a strategy to consolidate a national identity linked to productivity and optimal procreation. Those bodies incapable of adapting to the reproductive imperatives of the sexual differentiation system would be invested with a disability, the result of defective sexuality and its hereditary vices, from substance abuse to hysteria and prostitution. The dimension processes of the sexual subject were not independent from the set of processes that imagine the body as capable or incapacitated, and the treatment of disability in the Mexican clinic demonstrates the inseparability of the concept of sexual deviation from the colonial categories of the 19th century clinic, since neurological, racial, and gender differences were the starting points in the elaboration of physical and mental pathologies. The somatized reading of novels must be understood within a broad framework of disciplinary techniques of the body that diagnose a dysfunction against the villainous uses of the book. 2. Bovarism and neurometamorphosis. I want to insist that novel reading in the 19th century was a dynamic technology of sex and cognitive aptitude. In 1904, the Argentine jurist Belisario Monteros published in the magazine of the Italian Argentine psychiatrist José Ingenieros, Archives magazine, his text, Crimes Against Public Morality in Artistic and Literary Production. There he affirmed that youth was perverted because of the, quote, current light literature, immoral theater, licentious song. Everything is done in the name of art, committing abuse because of the difficulty in applying the rules to set limits where that art ends and obscene work begins. For his part, in 1910, Raquel Camaña, Argentine pedagogue, student of Ingenieros, and official rapporteur on sexual education before the Congress of Medicine and Hygiene that takes place in the context of the centennial, argued in her conference, The Sexual Education of Our Children, that poisoned reading should be controlled. Young people, according to Camaña, should practice good sense. And I quote, "We must speak to them with eternal frankness, with noble courage, about the sexual function, about the reproduction of the species, as the most essential of biological and social facts. And this regular, normal, healthy initiation is all the more necessary as than the spectacle of life on the streets, in theaters, in books, in newspapers, in advertisements, even in school and in the family itself, sometimes deforms or poisons in most cases. It is not a good idea to submit the future of the race to chance." This warning of the end of the human species as a result of bad readings had a fertile iconography of degeneration in the Argentina clinic and became an insistent motif in psychiatry fictions. New somatic specifications had emerged that entered the clinical culture of Buenos Aires, echoing the great neurotics of 19th century folklore. I would like to explore here a curious case that assembles the thematic architecture of Madame Bovary with that of Jekyll and Hyde by Robert Louis Stevenson. It is a neurometamorphosis, product of Bovarism and drug intoxication, that José María Ramos Mejía narrates in his text. La bromiamonía de los epilépticos. The doctor will dedicate his study to what he calls an unknown phalanx, that is, a group of individuals whose very purpose was to worship potassium bromide. Likewise, bromiophage epileptics will be seen as morphine addicts and hysterical camphorists, a whole narcotic family invested with a hereditary degeneration. In general, the bromiophages that Ramos Mejía discusses were docile subjects, lacking angry impulses, a result of the known sedative effect of this anticonvulsant drug, potassium bromide. However, the episode of psychotic bromiamania, starring a distinguished young man from an old Buenos Aires family, will stand out. N.N., his name remains anonymous, was 30 years old, married, of nervous temperament, and of an essentially artistic organization with very delicate mental tendencies. He was an enthusiastic writer who had collaborated in a newspaper in the capital. According to Ramos Mejía, he consumed in great quantity, I quote, the genre of romantic literature, of the passionate and excessive novel in which Madame Bovary's unbalanced neurasthenic takes its toll. N.N. indulged himself excessively in mental work, abusing cigarettes and coffee, which he consumed with a certain superstitious passion, according to him, because he attributed unknown cerebral properties to them. He had insomnia and palpitations, moments of supreme boredom and unbearable days, vague wishes and impulses to suicide, and finally the whole procession of symptoms and signs of a frank and complete hysteria." Close quote. The excessive literary exercise had depleted the energies of the patient, who develops a cognitive disability. Ramos Mejia points out that the patient goes to a doctor and insists that he prescribe a portion of potassium bromide to treat his condition. The patient's insistence on taking bromide is not surprising, as Mauro Vallejo points out in his recent book, Nervous and Neurotic in Buenos Aires, I quote, "The neurotics of Buenos Aires, the individuals who felt they were victims of these nervous ailments, threw themselves daily into that series of remedies and novelties." Close quote. NN took the bromide, and at first his symptoms dissipated. But he soon felt that he had to double his dose, and a paroxysm seized him. Thus began a theatrical effect, a coup de théâtre, a sensationalist action, dramatically sudden, a spectacular turn of events that translates into a kind of metamorphosis, a teratology, product of both the semiotic stimulation of the novel and the chemical stimulation of the narcotics. Ramos Mejia tells of this transformation process a la Jekyll and Hyde. This, of course, is on my own. I quote, "First came a sensation of fire in the skull, a general malaise, a feeling of tightness in the chest, and a deep sadness, accompanied by a burning desire to move, to walk from one side to the other, and wave the hands and compress at the head that seemed absent. So strong was the sensation of emptiness he felt in his skull. Then he would have had the most vehement and violent desire to drink the potassium bromide. He was taking the flask in a true delirium, with a decomposed face and the wild gaze of a maniac. One day, when the patient was walking quietly down the street, he suddenly felt his usual desires assail him. He felt strange sensations in his head, pains, the beginning of vertigo. Then he backed away, storming into the pharmacy, and asked for any potassium bromide drink to be dispensed for him. He took it in his hands and drank the contents of the bottle down to the last drop, with a burning and rabid hunger, without bothering to find out the dose." Close quote. The cure for his condition came from the intervention of a colleague of Ramos Mejia, Dr. Abel Ayerza, a famous Argentine cardiologist. Ramos Mejia says, "Convinced of the seriousness of his strange illness, he shut himself up in his house, while being attended to by Dr. Ayerza, with whose perfectly logical and rational treatment he has obtained, I believe, beneficial results." This is the spectacular production of the monster reader that Ramos Mejia proposes as a warning of bad readings, of the intellectual excess that leads to a teratological neurosis, product of the antidote that transforms it. This public dramatization of the metamorphosis affected the normal functioning of the Creole patriarch, as well as a mode of production of the labor force. Thus, the literary illnesses and psychoses generated by bromide will trace a persistent motif in the gallery of the great villains of hygienism. 3. Preliminary conclusions. The psychiatrization of reading generated attention in the script of the Latin American clinic. On the one hand, Bovarism attacked the normal cognitive and physical functioning of the adult population, as well as their roles as parents and heads of families, as political leaders, as suggested by the fictions of the incestuous sisters and the neurotic reader. But also, Bovarism ensured the stable reproduction of the psychiatric machine as a writer of disabilities. This productive ambiguity shows that the disorder of the imagination was written as a danger to cognitive futures, but also as a guarantee for the reproduction of psychiatric power, the only apparent administrator of the cure. The provision of the cure illustrates the interdependence of the actors in the psychiatric drama. The very structure of this scenario of symptoms causes a proliferation of reading crises whose main objective will continue to reproduce both the pleasures of the novel and the punishments. When reading this convergence between Bovarism and psychiatry, the somatization of fictional consumption shows how psychiatric fiction extended its dominance in the cultural sphere, generating new forms of extravagant pleasures and new mechanisms of control over eccentric bodies of the turn of the century. Thank you. On maternity, questioning eugenic and ableist discourses from my dwelling as woman with a disability. By weaving together the threads of feminism, eugenics, and disability, there is an interplot about desires and reproductive capacities, touching on, of course, the theme of motherhood and also parenting. Reproduction and motherhood are considered to be abilities, and it is assumed that women with disabilities do not have them. In this regard, the most violent expressions to prevent and control the procreation of women with disabilities are abortion and forced sterilization, practices that continue to be carried out in Mexico. The issues of abortion and forced sterilizations are issues that I will not address in this presentation, but I cannot fail to mention their importance, that they're also full of injustice, pain, ableism, and eugenics, and that feminist colleagues with and without disabilities are combating so that such practices might no longer be part of the Mexican context. Feminist comrades with and without disabilities are researching and documenting and are centering the participatory and informed consent of women with disabilities in the fight for reproductive justice. When we think of motherhood as an ability, we not only think of a body that can gestate, but also of the materialization of the role of the good mother and the good woman, whatever this means, from ableist and patriarchal perspectives. My presentation today revolves around three aspects that I have been thinking and reflecting on, and thanks to Susan's invitation, I have deepened and that I've come to share here. The first is related to making visible these symbolic and subtle expressions that do not imply the practices of abortion and forced sterilization, but that continue to signify ableist and eugenic desires on the part of society. Secondly, to show the need for the vindication of motherhood and non-motherhood from the feminist perspective, but also from a counter-ableist position. And finally, to make visible that there are women with disabilities who have decided not to exercise motherhood, but that this has not been recognized simply as a decision of our vital project, but has been recognized more as a kind of materialization of a eugenic and ableist indoctrination and control at a symbolic level. When I refer to reproductive justice, I find it important to trace its origins back to the Black and anti-racist movement. That is, Black women created this reproductive justice movement, expanding the right to make decisions about their own bodies from the same context as women and the intermingling of oppressions. In other words, the fight for reproductive justice is not limited to a legal interruption of pregnancy or a liberal vision where not having children means self-realization. For example, racialized and disabled women have been immersed in antinatalist policies where non-motherhood is imposed violently, for example, through forced sterilizations. From the perspective of reproductive justice, non-motherhood is understood as a right and as a choice over one's own body. My disability is visual, and in this sense, discrimination in the sexual and reproductive sphere has not been as severe as with other colleagues with disabilities. However, eugenic and ableist discourses have passed through doctors, family, and with myself. For example, there have been gynecologists who have not even asked me about my reproductive life. A gynecologist once told me that I didn't know what I was saying when I was talking to her that I didn't want to have children. An ophthalmologist also told me that if I planned to be a mother, then I did have to plan a pregnancy and undergo genetic tests to know the probability of inheritance of the disease. And the same ophthalmologist also told me that adoption was an option, so that the cultural imaginaries around motherhood and my disability have been very diverse. They've passed through different ranges. Likewise, I have not been approached with the typical questions and phrases that other women of my age live with regarding the pressures of the heterosexual matrix. The phrases or questions such as, "And when are you going to have children? You're already taking too long to have children." They're very typical questions and phrases in Mexico because in the Mexican context, motherhood is a mandate and an expected role for Mexican women. So when I go to family gatherings, those questions and phrases, or rather when the issue of children comes up, it exists as a kind of roll call with my female lineage, but I don't appear on that list. That is, there's a sort of unconscious or an indoctrination at a symbolic level, where it is assumed that I'm not going to exercise motherhood, but that no, I'm not asked because it is known or just assumed that I'm not going to be a mother. Well, motherhood is defined by the Mexican feminist psychologist Brenda Gomez Cruz as that social construction with economic, political, and cultural implications, which also have an importance in the social organization and in the subjectivity of women. Biological determinism, the maternal instinct or the representation of the feminine as something natural, as well as the self-realization of woman in being a mother, are closely associated with this woman-mother duality. However, feminism has also questioned motherhood and vindicated it by creating a rupture and assuming motherhood is something political. And on the other hand, it has also been a result of the decision in the woman's own body. These feminist questions and reflections also apply to us as women with disabilities. In our current context, not all women can be mothers. Women with disabilities are assumed to be incapable of reproduction and parenting. Their construction of motherhood, whether to exercise it or not, is haunted by ableism and by heterosexual patriarchy as well. The construction of motherhood through this ableist and patriarchal hallmark haunts us, women with disabilities, from an overprotection and an infantilization that unfolds towards non-motherhood, or rather towards the sentence of our non-motherhood. But that non-motherhood is not understood or recognized as a decision and part of a life project that we women with disabilities have decided on, but rather it is the appropriate result of these eugenic, ableist, and overprotective guidelines that obstruct our agency. In quotation marks, the good offspring, in quotation marks, the good mother, and in quotation marks, the good motherhood, are materialities and it is assumed that these materialities are not for a woman with a disability. These are questions related to care for life, where there are also phrases such as, and how did you dare to be a mother? And how are you going to take care of a baby when you have a disability? Or there is also this question of, how are you going to take care of a baby? They are phrases that are based in ableism, and also, on the other side, there are other phrases, also full of ableism, but that are oriented towards the creation of representations of exceptionality or sources of inspiration, creating this representation of the supermom with disability, for example, right? But they're also based on ableism. So that ableist thinking not only values disability as negative, but also begins to construct mothering as an ability, and those supposed maternal instincts or bonds are constructed as abilities through patriarchal and ableist mandates. So then it's also very necessary that motherhood is not only vindicated from a feminist position, but also as an anti-ableism that colleagues with disabilities are already practicing by exercising their motherhood as a rupture with those hegemonic modes of care and upbringing, and not conforming to obligatory bodily and mental integrity. And regarding a tension between the prevention of disease and disability versus the desire for the existence of disability as part of a future and even a present, you also find this notion that a better future and world means being born healthy. And in this regard, my colleague and friend, Jonathan Maldonado Ramirez, points out that desire for health begins with this binary differentiation and hierarchization of the genital organs, as well as an integral body. The anthropologist says that wishing for health is not intuitive, is it? Or nor is it instinctive or genuine, but rather there is a framework of effective heterosexist and ableist economies in which there are lives that represent figures of disappointment and failure. And in this regard, my colleague imagines this scenario where there's a possibility of wanting to be born intersex or with Down syndrome, for example, wondering if these wishes can mean longing for misfortune. And in this regard, Maldonado performs an analysis relating happiness to a healthy and capable body, while, for example, a disabled body is surrounded by these feelings of shame, pain, disappointment, sadness. So Jonathan somehow invites us to think that the promise of happiness is related to that fully productive body. They teach us to desire that fully productive body. But Maldonado points out that the ableist demands and violence somehow end up wishing to be healthy or being healthy, right? Ableist violence and demands continue to reproduce despite the existence of those healthy bodies. That is why he invites us to question those frameworks of the promise of happiness, because suddenly there is also a eugenic paranoia that regulates our concerns for the future and for the population. Then Maldonado also invites us to think, or rather to feel and think, that failure can also exist as a possibility. Well, I decided to not exercise motherhood as part of a choice and as part of a real project of my life, and not as an imposition of my representation as being dependent and incapable of caring for others. Because it is assumed that in having a disability, one cannot take care of others or support others. Suddenly, of course, these doubts come to me, right? And because of ableist dynamics or lived experiences of discrimination, and when these doubts arise, that sometimes I do not feel part of the support for others. It is when I also think of the interdependencies that constitute us as beings. And although I sometimes need assistance to carry out activities, at the same time, I also take care of others affectively, right? Or materially. Since I was a child and in adolescence, I always thought of myself without children. That is, I never associated the woman-mother duality. My adulthood arrived, and with it my glaucoma and my visual impairment. But the decision not to have children remained. It was a project of my life, part of my life. And in this regard, I agree a lot with the Mexican feminist psychologist Brenda Gomez Cruz when she says that the decision for non-motherhood is a decision that involves a process. That is to say, it is not from one day to the next, but in our life experience, milestones, meanings, and resistance appear in the face of gender technologies in a concrete way, gender technology related to the woman and mother duality. And here it seems important to me to point out that the decision is a process, and more so when there are decisions of this caliber, right? To exercise motherhood or not. For example, when there are families, doctors, or other people who ask girls with disabilities if they want to be mothers, and they say yes, suddenly there is this concern, right? This overprotection that makes sterilization materialize, right? And this, well, is also violence against the decision-making of, in this case, a girl, and then later, a woman with a disability. It seems to me that decision-making is taken very lightly at first, and when we decide to exercise motherhood or not, it is a process, right? And if that moment, the girl with a disability, for example, says yes because she still has a long way to go, and can continue to decide yes, or perhaps there is a point where she decides no, but it seems very important to me to understand these decisions as a process and decisions that must also be respected. And well, although I chose not to exercise motherhood, I also think it is important to say that in parallel there is this anti-ableist phantom where people, well, I kind of feel that I have been symbolically taught by deciding for me not to ask myself whether or not I want to be a mother, because they already assume that I'm not going to be a mother, not because of disability. It also seems important to me to emphasize that given my decision not to exercise motherhood, sometimes I thought that it was the result of an ableism that I myself was upholding. So, well, I thought that maybe I didn't want someone like me, or that from this good birth, I did not want to disgrace the future, right? So I began to reflect and came to the conclusion that rather what I did not want, and I do not want, is to inherit discrimination, violence, and oppression in the different areas of life, rather than this failure in the face of compulsory bodily integrity. And well, when we think and work from critical disability studies, it seems precisely that the critical key also means identifying these contradictions or tensions that we ourselves embody. That is to say, more than me wanting to embody the example of an anti-ableism, it seems important or more important to me to identify the tensions and contradictions that I myself felt, thinking about working on them, assembling them, in order to create other ways to question what seems to be already given and already naturalized or traced by the same systems of oppression. That is why situated and embodied experiences seem important to me, because I believe that this way, lines of flight can also be created. In this case, creating rules of flight that break with hegemonic motherhood, where women with disabilities are not present. For example, the denunciation of gynecological and obstetric violence that we experience as women with disabilities, or also assuming accompaniment in pregnancy, childbirth, and postpartum in accessible conditions in terms of information, communication, etc. Or also the option of adoption, but that the procedures should be accessible and that it does not matter if the woman lives with a disability. Also, lesbian motherhood, or the feminist and anti-ableist press. And from the lines of flight from non-motherhood, I think it is very important to respect the project of single life as a couple, or from other erotic affective relationships, and also to think about the possibility of collective nurturing, mothering, and care. In conclusion, I can say that it's important to define non-motherhood as a line of flight that has to be made visible, yes, as a right and as a part of a life project, but also in a concrete way, seen as the result of a project of reproductive justice from an anti-ableist position, and also as a decision that women with disabilities have made, and that should not then be understood as a symbolic or material indoctrination rooted in ableist and eugenic prejudices and stereotypes. Thank you very much.
Muchas gracias a Carlos Halaburda y a
Thank you very much, Carlos, for your presentations, which were fascinating, really interesting ones. We might remind you, if you want to leave questions in the chat, we can do it through YouTube and on Facebook. I have a question particularly addressed to Carlos, which has to do with the network. This I thought is fascinating, Bovaryism and everything related to Camaña and so on, the poisoned reading by some pieces of reading and delivering the future of race, which is something that we need to tackle hardly. And something else, this novel understanding has to do with what used to happen at the end of the 19th century, 18th century, seeing artists as fully detached from productive life, because what you and Diana have talked about a lot is how
hacia tener una
quote-unquote are steered to define performance. And if literature becomes like a target of what is not productive and should be disregarded within society, I don't know if this is a good reading of this. What do you think? I think you're muted. Thank you for your comments and for your question. When I first started my research program on the clinical literature, what I wanted to do is following Hemingway and having a goal for historic representation and narrative. I tried to see what the formal narrative strategies for sexuality were and their link with performance discourse and the components, biological and discourse components that are racialized. And so the text that I was interested in broader terms were sexual liberation were being dramatized of an evil to become it into evil. And literary naturalism have been widely criticized. That is, migrants, prostitutes, floating population, the homeless. That is, all this population that's wind up being the main foot for detention facilities. So what happened with those individuals that weren't a part of that intervention effort? And the neurotic and hysterical people, the theaters, the bourgeoisie, and so there were a lot of female reader novels and understandings in reading, in investing women as a new model, maybe excessively so in the case of Madame Bovary. But this is something that repeats itself in the naturalist work Blanca Sol, the Brazilian one, and so on. But what's the physician reading of an anxiety, of a misstatement that could potentially affect reproductive rights? And I found this where this evolves into a drama that takes a toll in reproductive rights. And so in connection with this, I was interested in language, the link, the responsibilities, care, everything revolves around this drama. So I think that this is where our research falls into, how maternity is being part of the discourse. I don't know if you want to comment more on this, because this is quite interesting.
Sí, muchas gracias.
Yes, thank you very much. About this regulations and how motherhood needs to be. A few years ago, I stumbled upon this case of Maritza Ibanez, who is a mentally disabled woman who bore a child, and the welfare agency removed her from his child because they claimed that the child wasn't living up to the conditions necessary, and that Marisa was mistreating him. So of course there was this small text of racist discourse in terms of motherhood. So this was a case in 2014 where she was removed from her child, and there's a legal process where the child was institutionalized to be put up to adoption. But before this, they asked Marisa to do a life program for her child. She didn't deliver, and so the child was put up in adoption. And then a multidisciplinary team with lawyers and other specialists came along, and the case was ruled by the Argentinian High Court of Justice with a special injunction. And so in 2016, they ruled for Marisa, but along the proceedings, of course, there are a lot of things saying about Marisa lacking the ability to take care of her child and so on. There are interviews on YouTube that I've done with Marisa about the lawyers that she is being supported with, and how Marisa also hits that motherhood role. I think this is a really interesting case because there are always the disabled woman is always being reviewed and scrutinized in terms of disabled mothers versus non-disabled ones. So in this regard, I think that nobody is born a mother, so disabled moms shouldn't be judged on that basis. So accompanying mothers are breaking those paradigms of hegemonic motherhood alongside what Rachel already talked about with psychosocial disabilities that there are many cases about, and also disabled women breaking the mold of with this hegemonic motherhood and trying to make a new type of motherhood.
Tengo un comentario de Marisa Adriana Miranda que dice
I have
brillantes.
another comment by Marisa. Brilliant sessions. Thanks. I must thank the organization. This is by Marisa Adriana Miranda. There is another question going back to Carlos Halaburda on psychiatric power, and all these power discourses that also Diana has been talking about that's remain until this date in terms of comprehensive production. So how are these power discourses structured? I mean, even in the case of Carlos, are situated in a particular time. How are they traveling to present time, and how are they kept up with?
En primer lugar, me interesa la noción de ruptura que...
First, the notion of breaking the mold is interesting because I was thinking where this mold could be broken, from what scenes, and what's the fictional grounds legitimating these performances and statements are go on and on in terms of power mnemonics, like not having children. This is a scenario that's being created. And so in the clinical text, I was really interested in seeing, on the one hand, the morale from teachers, psychiatrists, novelists, and other celebrities that are writing for a psychiatry magazine, and where this scenario and performance can be seen, where there is like a steering person behind that makes these eccentric awareness possible. So what I was trying to see is how the Bovary expert, going beyond gender, puts productive ideas in jeopardy. What happens with the neurotic this wouldn't match the productive individual, like the petty criminal figure, where all this serving population is comprised, and where we have a manual written down for the police to put these guys in Buenos Aires correctional facility with that a lot of experts have talked about. But what happens with Bovary experts and hysterical persons and so on? There were people who could be on hours on end binge watching Netflix. And what happens with this? Because the problem of stigmatizing a Bovary expert also has to do with Netflix binge watchers or casino players. All of these has existed in the psychiatric discourse, like isolation, loss of judgment, loss of connection with reality. But what I can see so far as part of my research results is how fiction formats shape reality rather than how reality is being portrayed. And there is how I could see the link between the productive behavior and the aesthetic artifacts, because on the one hand, they're naturalists, canvaseres, in Buenos Aires, and then the other leakage points that also shape these eccentric 19th century eccentricities. I have something else by Diego Casares. He's saying congratulations, and a question for Diana. What are the authors to delve more into capacitism and the relationship with disabled motherhood and the disability seen as something childlike? Okay. About the first one, we have Kumari Carmen with a number of pieces online. This is in English. There are very short texts by Mario Toboso on that topic as well. That's a part of a Lucas Platero book. And also, there's a Spanish magazine, De la Mata, where a small article, I don't remember the author's name, but this speaks about small microaggressions, where I don't really think I agree with this, but it's really interesting because capacitism understood as practices, behaviors, and beliefs where only somebody who's whole is being regarded as positive. All of this is shaping up a diagram of existentialism and other capacitist practices on protection, like thinking it from this standpoint, like not being able to make decisions, and this is why we're being taken care of. But this is rather a patriarchal rule, because overprotection is also overlapping with other understandings. I think this is really interesting. And also going back to disabled motherhood, I think there are many other mandates from an overprotection standpoint, because here is like saying we won't be able to take care of somebody else, the childlike behavior of desexualized, disabled women as being regarded as children. Also, in terms of productive and reproductive mandates, I also think I like Marta Nussmann a lot because she questions productivity and how the disabled are being left aside, because productivity, as she understands it, is being able to contribute to society. And so this is always being materialized from a patriarchal capitalist standpoint. And so she, in some way or another, breaks that mold. And with analyze contributions being something not non-material, like affectionate contributions. So I also think that providing this place, giving a place to feelings as part of relationships, because all of this is being left aside as if it were nothing. So we always think of productivity as capitalist productivity, as materialistic productivity. So this results in leakages of feelings as being contributions in life, which I also think is really important. Thank you very much. There is one more question. I also think, Diana, that falls in what you're saying as well. What happens with depressed anxiety in motherhood? Do you consider these women to be disabled? What happens if, in order to get pregnant, they must quit their meds? How do we go around this if meds are, mental aids? Well, this is a really interesting question. I don't want to be definitive, but I also think that psychosocial voices disabled voices are really helpful. And I want to echo what they write. So I think medications is not capacities per se. Medical treatments have to go through a personal decision making. I think it's capacitism when they're forced to have treatment with given medications. But there is a great deal of difference between that and obligation versus being able to decide on their treatments and what meds to take or not to take. So this is on the one hand. Then on the other hand, depression. There are stances of psychosocial disabilities or just simple ways of being, but neither of these dispense women from being able to be mothers. So there is a stigma on psychosocial disability, and that makes children be removed from their mothers, something that was already talked about. There are other women who may not disclose their disability and they continue to be mothers. But there are other readings where children themselves say that their mom's craziness was not hindering, but rather promoting her abilities to be a mother in a different way, from crazy standpoint, which is important for children and mothers alike. So I wouldn't point out necessarily that non-motherhood must exist because of depression or as a result of other conditions. I think that what we must break the mold of hegemonic motherhood and assume those other ways of being in the world under whatever conditions. What you say is highly important, and I agree, because one thing is to choose to take medication to change your state of mind. As you were speaking, I thought of some writers writing on depression, like Andrew Solomon, Blue Day Demon on depression. And then he runs an analysis, and then he talks about this depression of his. But the problem that you are talking about is another thing entirely, like when you are forced into treatment because of power ties, and this is what's really interesting. I don't know if you have any questions or anything else to say about forcing medical treatments to somebody. This is a quite complex matter, and the last research that I did on the link between market capacitism, reproductive rights, heterosexism, sexual differentiation systems. A lot of activists like Paul Preciado's text, the Monster Talks, he describes testosterone as poetical, and speaking of hormones as partners versus the sexual differentiation system, where testosterone is regarded as one of the gender prosthetics, redemptive prosthetic appropriation of medications and drugs to start breaking the mold with this body control system in such a way that what they do is destigmatize medications and these molecular prosthetics and put it in somatic communism, as he recalls it, like a somatic non-pathological community that is able to break the eugenics impulses and rules. This is what came to mind. What came to mind now, that is how we can narrate a treatment today versus literature, partners, friends, an epic versus the clinical industry. So I think this also has to do with storytelling on the disabled and the abled, what's normal, what's heteronormal, and the new queer criticism. I think
yeah, this is the first idea that I had in mind. If the artist, through this stigmatization of the artist and the writer, it's as if all of a sudden there's a power speech that leads it to the creepy part of society. I mean, the idea that in order to be an artist, if you need to be in contact with something and abnormal. You have to be an eccentric. that, yeah, there is indeed proof that many artists are part of this, like this imaginary. But I think that there are many things at play of what the artist can say. Like, if you put me within this framework, I'm going to play that role. The artist, a Dali, that it's somehow eccentric, and that's why you are so amazing. But indeed, it sounds a little bit like a performance, an ableism or capacitism, and it's also somehow a capitalist perspective. So it's interesting. I think we have to close the panel.
Perdón. Ok, yo ya
No sé si puedo hacer una pregunta.
Well, we have still more than enough time, so we can continue the conversation. Something that was interesting for me, and in the case of both presentation, is the separation between productivity of reproduction and motherhood with sexual pleasure, just to put it forward. In the 19th century, all of a sudden it sounds more interesting. We feel like going back and reading Madame Bovary and taking all those drugs, because that's where the pleasure lies. While nowadays it's more like you have to be a good mother, a good father. And so I believe it's kind of interesting, like what happens with pleasure in this historic continuum, considering the relationship between the sexuality and reproduction. Of course, there is a complication between motherhood and sexuality, but maybe we could think about it from a wider point of view. But I was wondering, like, what happens with pleasure? Because it has somehow to do with the framework of psychiatry, because it's a pleasure, but at the same time it's productive or not. I mean, it makes me wonder. My grandma used to joke, like, when you get married, you need to pray, saying it's not a vice, it's to give a son for your service, like, talking to God. And I remember completely laughing at when my grandma said that, because it's like, what is she talking about? Like this. But I'm sorry, just wanted to recall that funny moment. Indeed, Susan, this new conservadorism we are living, where everything is typified, everything is built and consumed as a show. But it's not extravagant. Maybe when you read these classifications of the clinical works of the 19th century, of the fetish, people who have orgasms playing the piano, all of this has an impact, because we all believe that it's sort of a tale of someone telling a story, or a great editor. And not many doctors would send their articles to the magazine. Like in the case of what is now called a trans subjectivity. And there was an ending referring to a literary character. And these were the kind of things that happened in the 19th century that are a complete contrast with the epistemologies, the so clear epistemologies that we have now between the artistry and the clinic and the laboratory. and all these separate realms that we are living now. I believe that nowadays pleasure is so codified and also is thought of as a commodity, so different from the 19th century. But well, this was interesting for me. This willing to classify pathologies with big names, with amazing names, so to speak, but you know, the genetologist of laughter. When we talk about well, different studies, so well, it made me wonder. Reading this kind of texts of the 19th century is it's an interesting pleasure. Yes, now that you were talking about artists and how their genius, these quite renowned artists, it sometimes happens that in the media there is some ableist bias, especially regarding some artists. Like, oh, this artist is amazing because he's an autist, or he's amazing because he's deaf, and this bias, this ableist biases, when it comes to making a relationship with artistry, they are also a source of exceptionality. It's like sort of an inspirational porn. So I was recalling this, and also speaking about what Susan just mentioned, pleasure, and it comes to my mind how for non-motherhood, how to exercise a non-motherhood, it's a matter of pleasure. With this role that, oh, you're a mother and you have to sacrifice all of your life and everything. And then becoming a mother, it's more like having more time for leisure and other pleasures. The premises have changed, because it's not just a matter of pleasure per se when you exercise your non-motherhood. There are so many things around it. There is a process involved that has to do with breaking the patterns of what is thought of motherhood. Of course, when you show motherhood as something that's different from what is usually thought of, like the mother has to sacrifice and she has to give everything. And sometimes you wonder, well, during motherhood, although you suffer, but at the same time, there's really cool things about being a mother. It's like a mixture of both. You have a great times, but at the same time you suffer a lot. And in the end, we don't know how to be mothers. It's something you learn. So this idea of pleasure and saying yes, pleasure, they're not mutually exclusive. You don't have to let pleasure go just because you are a mother. We have a minute left, so I don't know if you wanted to share a reflection. No, I just wanted to thank the invitation and the possibility to talk about this subjects. Diana, I love your work, and I hope we can work together in the future. And also thanks to Susan. Thank you, Carlos and Susan. Thanks for the invitation for me. This has been enriching. Every presentation has been quite interesting. There are so many realities that need to become visible. So, well, thank you so much. Very briefly, congratulations to our panelists. Thanks, Salvador, for moderating. There has been a lot of chatter. And I remind the people who are listening that we have a last session of general conversation as a closure and final discussion. But this starts an hour from now, but it's after lunch. So please come back to our closure. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.